Well, up till now, we've been talking a lot about things that maybe aren't necessarily your fault. If you're involved in a worship team, sometimes you don't get to choose whether or not you're using in-ear monitors or whether or not you're trying to replicate it like the album, all those kind of things that factor hugely in whether or not you're going to get turned down. But today, we are going to turn a corner into the things that pretty much you have full control over. So let's get started. Well, hello everybody. Welcome back. My name is Stephen Reed. I'm part of the team here at Music and Ministry, and we are in this huge dive into how to not get turned down when you are up on your worship team. And unfortunately, as we've been talking about a lot, it happens all the time in churches all over the place. And we don't want it to happen to you because we want, your time to be valued and for you to actually be a part of the team that you're on. And so we've talked a lot about bad systems. We've talked a lot about your pride last week, talking about how that affects. And that's not that those things are going to go away or that we're not going to move on from this, but we've laid a lot of groundwork into things that affect you greatly. But up till now, we have pretty much said, if you put yourself into this situation, you're going to have problems. And whether or not you do things perfectly, you're still probably going to make mistakes. But today we're going to talk about, well, there's some things that we don't do perfectly. And one of those is maybe the most obvious, which is going to be playing at the right volume. And so just a short review, we've talked about the three things that you need in order to stay in, to not get turned down, is you got to play the right part at the right time with the right sound. And so today we're talking about that third one, the right sound. And part of that is going to be, at the right volume, because if you are too loud, then it makes sense that the sound person, that's their job. They're going to turn you down. All right. And so certainly when everybody gets together, the guitar is too loud, the drums are doing this or whatever, and they will put those things into balance. And so what happens though is that we're not saying, don't play at a good volume. Is the main reason why people could get turned down is that they play something, one moment is too loud. And so it's not that they're overall too loud. It's just that they're not consistent. All right. So if you're taking notes at home, this is what we would say is to play at a consistent volume. Because if you at any point go too loud, that sound person is going to reach over, and depending on how much you've talked, depending on how much they like you, depending on how much they trust you, depending on what kind of technology that is that you guys are using in your sound system, they will reach and they will pull you down. The question, and this is the challenge of live sound versus a recording, is that because it's all happening as you're going, you don't get a chance to then possibly go back and be like, I'm just going to turn you down for a second. And so what happens with sound people is they're going to turn you down, and there's this delay that's going to be before they'll even consider turning you back up. And so depending on who you are, depending on whether or not you have a history of being inconsistent in your playing, depending on if they're bored or if they have a lot of other things that they're messing with, a lot of times people get turned down in a moment and then they get left down. All right. And so then you're out, even though you only made a mistake at the beginning, and the rest of the time maybe you did it perfectly. Well, it's too late. You got turned down and then maybe you got left down. All right. So sometimes I compare this to the usually mentioned in culture arcade game, the Whack-A-Mole. And it's this arcade thing where they have the different holes and there's this little cuddly, cute mole looking thing. It pops up and you have this foam hammer thing that you go and you hit, and it pops up, and then you never know which one's going to pop up, and you get more points if you hit it faster. That's what it sometimes feels like as a sound person. And I often run sound as well as leading worship and preaching. And so I'm kind of this interesting person that can go between the different worlds and talk about how that works. But as a sound person, you're standing there, you're watching the team. It's all happening in real time. And so if anything sticks out, you're going to instantly, partly because running sound, sometimes you get a little bored, you're going to reach over and pull those things down because you're trying to keep everything in balance as it's going. And it's kind of like a lot of spinning plates at times where what are they going to do? What are they going to not do? And there's some people that as a sound person, you have a little bit more trust in, and they hit something that stands out. And you're like, I'm going to give them a couple more times. And then if they do it again, then you reach over and then you kind of pull them back a little bit. Now, again, because it's all happening in real time, because there's a matter of trust being established there, if you don't have much trust in them, then you'll just leave it down. And so there takes a while. There's this delay in the chance of you then getting turned back up. So if I can tell you anything as far as what you're doing, you have to play consistently, because otherwise you're going to step on that just habit of sound people and you're going to get buried and stay buried the rest of the time. So play consistent. All right. So the other thing that you can do to help you know whether or not that is happening, because if you're in one of those bad systems where you have your in-ear monitor, you're playing, you think it sounds good, well, you don't hear when the sound people are turning you down, because what they do doesn't affect what you hear. You think everything's fine. And so we have to establish what we call that tether or that lifeline. We have to have some sort of feedback loop where the sound person is telling you what is happening. Otherwise, they're just going to go on with their day. And so if I could tell you something else about sound people, is that almost every sound person at churches across the world has no authority to tell you anything, nor do they feel any responsibility to tell you anything. So they're just going to turn you down and bury you and let you go about your merry way. So you then have to initiate conversation with your sound person. And that is a loaded statement that comes with a lot of issues, in the sense of sound people will first of all be surprised that you asked anything. Secondly, will have sometimes a hard time communicating to you what it is that they're doing, or they may not say it in the nicest way, or they may use a different musical language than you are familiar with. And they'll be like, oh, I had to cut you at 1.2K and then I pulled you down a few dB, and you'll be like, what is that now? Up or down or what? And I'm here to try and help you with all of that. That isn't necessarily the discussion we're going to have today, but you have to be patient and kind of work through that and realize that that conversation may be a little more challenging than just, hey, tell me when you're turning me down. And that's what I want to know. So when I get done with the song, I will say, hey, did that work? Do you want anything different from me? I gave it a little less in the chorus here, and sometimes they'll tell me and sometimes they won't. And so then I often will go after the service and say, hey man, was there any point where you kind of wanted to turn me down, or you felt like I was getting turned down? And if they're honest, then that's the kind of stuff I'll be like, yeah, in that chorus you kind of got a little busy and I brought you back down. I'm like, okay. And so then I'm making mental notes, because I don't want to do anything that's going to upset the sound person or that the sound person doesn't like. And whether or not you like it, whether or not you like that sound person or the way that they mix, they are the gatekeeper. They're the one that is going to decide whether or not you get turned down. And so their reality is your reality. All right. And we, as again, bad systems, often create our own virtual reality and just think the sound people are dumb or don't know what they're talking about or don't listen to them if they do talk to us. And we forget that their reality is our reality. So if they don't like what you're doing, you're going to get turned off. And again, because of all of the other issues we've been discussing, they're probably not going to tell you. So you have to go and seek that information. All right. So unbelievably important how that is. All right. Because you get into these moments and you're playing what you think sounds good. And if you stick out in a way that they don't like, it's over. All right. So we got to avoid that. All right. So when we talk about how do we play consistently, and that is going to have a lot to do with our just general volume. And we make quite a few mistakes in our normal playing because we're trying to follow what we believe is going to be the overall flow of the song structure, where it's like, well, here's the verse, and then we're going to go up. We're all going to get louder to the chorus, and we're going to come down for the next verse. We're going to get louder, and then we're going to get really loud. And we're going to talk about that maybe in another video, because that is not how music actually works. And that's because there's what we're going to talk about today is there's a significant amount of things that are done, especially the recordings that we all seem to love and are very much trying to replicate in our live environment, that is done to make everything, every note being played at an even volume. And I'm saying this, and I know that most of you are in that number 2 category that we've been talking about, are 6 things of why you won't get any better. And that number 2 one was ignorance, meaning, and I was the same way. I had no idea how much was being done to make every single note Every single, vocal inflection, every single part of it is designed and meticulously crafted by sound engineers to be exactly the same volume. And you would say, I don't believe you. All right, maybe, or you just aren't familiar with those bits and pieces of technology. All right, now obviously in a recording, you can go back and go back and go back and slow it down and make it very meticulous. Well, we don't have that luxury when we come into our live scenario. And so right away, we have to make an adjustment as a player because we can't use our technology. So we have to make adjustments as a player. And then not every church has the same equipment, and not everybody knows how to use some of that equipment that would help us to achieve that very consistent sound that we're looking for. And so part of it is the difference between volume and then sounding different. And we'll talk a lot about that in probably our next episode. But there's a big difference between actual dynamics, meaning getting louder and getting softer, and what I would refer to as perceived dynamics, meaning it's the same volume, but you're actually singing more intense and you're singing quieter, but yet you're able to keep it all at exactly the same volume. So another conversation you have to have with your sound person is to understand what amount of technology do you have working for you, hopefully, in order to help you maintain that consistent sound that everybody really likes, even though we don't necessarily understand that that's what it is that we like, because it sounds like it's getting louder, but it's not actually getting louder. And I'll prove that to you in the next episode. All right, so some of those pieces of the technology, the first one is going to be, are you using any kind of compression? And there's a lot of people, especially, it took me so long to figure out how to make compression work and how it sounds good. And I would turn knobs and it just kind of made it sound not great. And I didn't understand that there's, a secret button that you use to make it sound better. But basically compression is that it allows you to get to a certain volume. And then if you get above that level, which we call the threshold, then it's going to start to push back. And so how hard it pushes back is called the ratio. Is it going to be lightly pushing back, or is it going to be really pushing it back? And they'll sometimes refer to that as squashing it. And that ratio depends a lot. And then like how quickly, if you go above that, is another setting. And so we kind of get to this thing where you can get to this volume and then you can get no louder, or you can get a little bit louder, but it's going to only let you get to this loudness. All right. So if you're looking for a consistent sound, that's definitely something that's going to help you keep consistent. I run on my electric guitar a compressor pedal for that very reason, meaning that I can play super hard or I can play super quiet and it will all be basically the same volume. And that's, again, seems crazy, but that is the sound that we're looking for. And so then I make that sound either sound distorted and aggressive, or I can make that sound clean and subtle or ambient, but yet I'm still keeping it at this solid volume, again, because if I stick out too far, the sound person is going to turn me down and may or may not turn me back up. All right. So compression then does mostly in turning things down. All right. And we want consistent, which is half of the equation here, is turning things down. Now, the miracle button is the makeup gain, which is gain or makeup gain, depending on what your settings are, will make the quiet things louder. All right, so the compression will push it down if it gets too loud, but then it will also bring up the volume to where the quiet things are now louder. And so then you have a lower range of how much sound dynamics can possibly happen within that. Now there's some, depending on what type of instrument it is, there's some downsides to bringing up that gain, because it brings up what we call the noise floor, means it makes everything louder, all the things that the bleed of things that you may not want to hear, and can cause some feedback at times, but it's definitely makes it sound better. Now, that is the standard thing on most digital soundboards. You're going to have that, and a lot of outboard gear, the stuff that you see on racks next to analog soundboards, a lot of those would be compressors. And the fancy compressors that you use on recordings, those ones are like $1,000 per one, which will only do one channel, and so you don't often see those on analog boards, although sometimes if you do any like behind the scenes on touring things, they have some of those that people will travel with. But in your soundboards, your digital soundboards, a lot of them will model those specific compressors, because each compressor sounds a little bit different, and there are some that are for voices, there's some for instruments, some settings that you would use for like your drums, which drums are heavily compressed, voices are heavily compressed. There's a lot of compression that goes on at multiple layers that I would encourage you to get really good at, because it definitely gets that consistent sound that you like and people like. So it would be good for you. But again, if you don't have that, then you have to play different, because that technology is not going to be holding you back like it would be nice if it did. All right. There is one extra layer of technology that some people use. It's pretty advanced. You have to have either a really fancy soundboard, or you have to have a plug-in, meaning that you use a computer to plug into your soundboard and they'll run some things like that. It's a company called Waves, and they have this live version of what's called a vocal writer. And so it is like literally your sound person being every syllable, every note, every second, adjusting the volume of the voice, usually used on voices because people like it really consist on voices, and it will just like minutely and just instantaneously adjust the volume of your voice to keep it at the exact same volume. And I could go through and show you how to use that, but you should look it up. Waves.com is a plugin company based out of Israel, and you want to look for the vocal writer, and it has before and after demonstrations. And I mean, everybody uses it that I know, or they're doing it manually, which is possible. You can go in and automate every single, but like syllable by syllable, note for note, everything is being adjusted to be exactly the same volume. And again, most people don't have that when you come into your live setting. And so then if you're just going to sing like you would in the studio and seeing how you think they look on the recordings, well, there's a lot of technology that's going into making that sound good. And so if you're using that, then you can sing pretty much however you want and it will fix it for you. But if you don't have that, then you have to learn how to sing differently. And so classic example of the reason why most vocals get turned down is because they go from singing a lead line, and then they will then turn and sing a backup line, but they'll sing it in exactly the same tone of voice. So you would think, well, yeah, you got to turn the background vocalist down. It's like, well, no. The reason why they get turned down is because they're still singing like a lead vocalist. And those two things are completely different. All right. So volume, and then certainly tone as well as the background vocalist. And so if you continue to sing at the same intensity, the same volume that you were singing as the lead person, and then you go to sing background, then the person's going to turn you down. They may bury you because those things don't often blend very well because it's too bright, and there's a whole lot of issues there. So for us, for my wife and I, when we lead praise and worship, we lead together, and then we will interchange between singing, who's singing lead and who's singing harmony, on a pretty like random and inconsistent basis, meaning that some songs I'll sing and the next like part of the song I'll take over the lead because it gets too high for her, or it just seems like it would be a good time, or I'll start leading something. We'll say something directionally as far as like spiritually, like, hey, let's sing that again. And then I'll sing something, and then she'll take back over the leading of that, and then I'll switch to harmony. So basically that means it's impossible for the sound person to be adjusting us to who's up and who's back. And I always tell sound people, like, don't even try. Like, you're going to feel like maybe you want to try, but like, don't do it. So you just have to tell us. And again, establishing that connection, that tether between us and the sound person. When we're in rehearsal here, like, you have to tell us whether or not we're achieving what it is that we think we're achieving. And so we have to learn, how do I sing lead? This is the volume that I need to sing lead at. This is the tone that I need to sing lead at. And then when it's time to sing harmony, I can't just sing the harmony note at the same volume in the same tone and manner. I have to, on my own, bring it down, and then I have to make it darker in the sense of, and you don't enunciate quite as much. And so it allows you to stay in the mix without the sound person making any adjustments. Because again, if they turn you down, the chances are high that they're going to leave you down. So you don't want to do anything to do that. All right. So making those changes on your own will then keep you in the game, versus then if you go for something and go higher. All right. So also, if you go for those moments, say that there's some like moment where you're like, I'm just going to go for it, well, the sound person's going to turn you down. And again, they may or may not bring you back up. And so you want to learn to realize, sing that moment, but you have to sing it in a way that doesn't blow out everybody's ears or doesn't cause it to be loud. So a vocalist, you can, back off from the microphone a little bit, or there is a way to control your voice to where you're singing aggressive, but it's not super loud, where you're changing the sound of your voice instead of using volume to, create whatever effect that it is that you're looking for. All right, same thing for drums, same thing for the other instruments. And there are, just the idea of dynamics, playing louder and quieter, is sometimes available to you, but things like a bass, like being louder or quieter, is not an option for a bass. You're either in or you're out. And it's this wild thing that if you try to play louder, then they're just going to turn you down and then keep you at whatever your loudest moment was. All right, so another example will be the drums. A lot of times drums will start off in, they'll do the sound check, it'll be up, everybody is in, and then they're going. And then partly you get to these sections where maybe there's, and this happens a lot, where in maybe the second verse, there's kind of a tom thing, a driving tom thing in the rhythm. And so, you would normally be a hi-hat snare and then doing the thing, but then in the verse there's a little boom, dum, dum type thing going on there. And that was my impression of the drum set. It was pretty good, if I do say so myself. But if you are playing that and not adjusting your own volume, and you're like, well, that's the part, that's the one I'm supposed to play. But yeah, you're playing it too loud. And so you'll end up getting turned down and the toms will go down. And I can't tell you how many services I've been in where the drums were doing great and then all of a sudden down they go, all right? And then they stay there for the rest of the service because the sound person can't trust you to play the right part at the right time with the right sound, all right? And so you have to realize that in those moments, like, yes, that's the right part. Maybe that's as intense as they're looking on the video, but you have to know that during the recording, they have gone back and they have adjusted the volume of each one of those hits. So that way it serves the vocals, serves what's happening in the rest of the group. And so it's not as loud as you think that it is. And so you got to bring your volume down. The other thing is it has to be exactly at the right time, because if you're playing over what would be the vocals, because a lot of time toms happen in the in-betweens, right? So there's like a vocal line, da, 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 and there'll be a big drum fill, doo, 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 and then the person starts singing again. Well, here in this verse, you're playing the toms while people are singing, and so all of a sudden there's this competition for, well, now I can't hear the vocals because the drums are so loud. Well, the vocals are almost always going to win, and so then you get turned down. So you have to recognize, am I playing something? Am I competing for the volume of the thing that's most important? Well, you got to make sure that you're under that and that you're serving the vocal, serving what's happening in that moment. Same would go if it was guitar or solo or with some other instrument was doing something. You can't be louder than that. You got to be in the right spot for that moment. All right. So again, if you're using compression, you got maybe some chance that would pull you back, but most of the time it would be better if you were doing that as a drummer and just recognizing less or more or whatever. And so then at the end, if you can go back and be like, hey, is that working on the verse? And he'd be like, actually, I could use a little bit more for you on the verse. Well, that's a much better spot to be than saying, well, I had to turn you down. Or maybe they just won't tell you because they don't want to start an argument with you. Never know how that's going to go. All right, well, we're just getting started in this. We'll spend at least another week, if not more, and we'll keep referring to it often. But one of the biggest ways to not get turned down is to play consistent volume and make sure that you connect with your sound person. Find out what equipment that you have so that way you can know whether or not it's there to assist you. And then you also have to have that conversation and that relationship with them to know, hey, is there any point where you're turning me down, want to turn me down, and then make the adjustments accordingly so that way you guys are working together, living in that actual reality, which is whatever is coming out of the main speakers that they have complete control over. So it's good to do. All right, have a great week, and we will see you next time.